I have a little thing that I do whenever I come and do talks. I take a photo of the audience. So if you're too shame, hide your faces. Oh, you're looking lovely. Look at you. Beautiful. All right. Chair's too nice not to take it. Before I start, I'd just like to pay my respects to the Biripi Nation, elders past and present, any young Koori fellas who are here with us today, and to everyone who's here as well. As mentioned, I'm a Gamilaroi fella, so my mob are northwest New South Wales, but I grew up off country. I was born in Sydney, raised in Wagga, did a primary teaching degree up in Newcastle, and then stumbled somewhere along the line onto Twitter, and a few years later, here we are today. Loved the last talk that we had, and yeah, whenever I hear that passion and that excitement, I always think about the origins of these concepts. And when we're talking about sustainability, that is something that within Indigenous Australia, within other Indigenous groups around the world, was core to the philosophy of how we lived our lives, how we conducted our day-to-day business. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around Indigenous philosophy. In fact, I think it's a term probably a lot of you have never actually heard before. Whenever we talk about Indigenous anything, it's Indigenous art, Indigenous culture. That's usually about it. But when we talk about other societies, when we talk about Western society, we talk about Greek philosophy, law, art, culture. We talk about the myriad of things, yet for some reason, even though we've got over 200 nations in Australia, over 40,000 years of history within that, everything just gets put down in this little pigeonhole of it's just culture. And unfortunately, it doesn't always get unpacked a lot into what that actually means and what that actually looks like. And so what I try to do with Indigenous X, I don't know what's behind me, am I pointing at anything that matters? There we go. That's Indigenous X, that's our Twitter account. So like I said, I used to be a primary teacher and I loved it. That's all I'd really wanted to be in my later teenage years. Went off to uni, did the degree, stayed teaching in the classroom for less time than I spent at uni learning how to be a teacher. And that's sadly fairly common with a lot of Indigenous teachers. We've got a pretty high dropout rate within teaching within the first 3 years. And so, a lot of people here would know, unfortunately, there's still a lot of racism that goes on in Australia, and a lot of that happens at the school level. Now, a lot of students encounter that at some point in their schooling, but don't always realise a lot of teachers actually encounter that as well, and not just on the playground, but at a staff room level, at a departmental level. And I was a bit young and a bit probably over-enthusiastic about trying to change the world and wanted to take everything on. And yeah, butted heads with the department a few times, and after a while I just sort of thought, I don't think I can be here right now. I need to go and find another path, another opportunity. The good thing about being a teacher is you take those skills with you wherever you go. One of the greatest things, it means I'm pretty comfortable sitting up on front of a stage and talking. And if anyone's interested in being a public speaker or scared of public speaking, all you need to know is most people are only sort of listening 20% of the time anyway. So don't get too worried about what you actually say when you're up on stage. You just have fun, think out loud with it. But along that process, I joined Twitter long before it was a thing that you would see. If you watch the news today, all of the journalists will have their @name underneath their story, or read in the newspaper about a Twitter storm. You'll see all of this emphasis put on the power of social media. That wasn't really a thing that was talked about when I started, but I felt that it was something that had that potential and had that opportunity. And I really treated it as my sort of online classroom, but not just where I was a teacher, but where I was a learner as well. So I probably spent 3 years on there just trying to challenge the way people thought, God, there was a lot of racism online back then. There's still a lot there now, but luckily it's sort of decreased, particularly on Twitter. I think there's still huge amounts of it on Facebook, unfortunately. But after 3 years, I started getting listened to. People would start to invite me to events. People would start to ask me to do radio interviews or write articles or sit on a board, or they'd send me things, and it's like, can you just let us know if we've done this horribly wrong or if this is right? No one really wanted to pay for that back then, but I used to get a lot of opportunities to have a positive impact on things. And it was really gratifying, but at the same time, I'm very mindful. Like I said, we've got hundreds of different nations. We've got 600,000 different individuals who've all got their own story, have all got their own history, have all got their own perspectives. And for some reason, despite that diversity, despite that couple of hundred years of interaction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, a lot of people still have this view that we speak with one voice and that we think with one mind. And I'll commonly hear people say, oh, but I met an Aboriginal guy once and he said something slightly different to what you're saying, so who's right and who's wrong, rather than going, well, obviously people can have differences of opinion. People can have different experiences, people can have different attitudes, whether it be about language use, whether it be about philosophy, whether it be about expressions of culture. And that's something that's perfectly natural, and I think we understand that in our social groups, we understand that within our family groups, we understand that at a national level, and for some reason all too often with Indigenous issues, we don't seem to remember that. And so Indigenous X was born out of a desire to help people understand the diversity of Indigenous views, and not in a framework of right or wrong, better or worse, but purely in the perspective of different life experiences, exposure to different attitudes, lead people to think different things. And when it comes to, we've got a lot of serious issues in Australia, a lot of environmental issues, a lot of issues that impact really adversely on Indigenous peoples right across the country. And I don't think that any one person, any one theory, any one attitude has all of the answers to that. So with Indigenous X, what I like to say is that no one has all the answers, but everyone's got a story to tell. And there's value in being able to share your story with a large group of people, and there's value in those people actually taking the time to just sit down and listen, not to get into a big debate, not to over-examine it, not to necessarily go, oh, I have to agree with everything you're saying or I have to disagree with everything you're saying, but just understand where that individual is coming from. And that's what Indigenous X tries to do. So it's a very simple idea. We have a different Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person each week who takes control of the account, and there's no rules. They can say whatever they want, do whatever they want. That's their week, they're up on stage, and they take that onto, we do fundraising, people do petitions, people try to educate. Just last week we had a group over in WA who their language group only has about 12 fluent speakers of their language left, 12 people. And most of them are very elderly. And so they're trying to make some resources, some videos, get more language classes happening to pass on that language to the future generations. And they're just trying to raise about $10,000 to be able to do that. I think they got just over halfway that week. But other weeks we just have someone who might really love basketball and want to talk about basketball. Sometimes we might have a foodie who just wants to take photos of food. Sometimes we have people who are struggling to come to terms with their place in Australia as an Aboriginal person and want to talk about that. And it's something that oddly, more Aboriginal people are forced to think about that, just that, what's it like to be an Aboriginal person? Which is a thing that not a lot of other groups necessarily have to encounter. What's it like to be a white person? You just sort of go, I just live my life, I don't even think about it. Whereas we get sort of challenged with those ideas and the idea that every Aboriginal person can educate everyone else about every Indigenous issue at the drop of a hat, all day, every day, and that we sort of are there for that purpose. And it's a huge pressure for those people who do want to impact on racism, who do want to educate other people. It can be very draining, it can be very frustrating. And that's why something like Indigenous X, and there's a whole range of other projects that work in different ways but do their own way of trying to alleviate that burden and say, if you are really curious about it, you can go and find out about it. You can go and look online, you can talk to people, you can read books, you can watch videos, you can tune into NITV. Sorry, I thought I had to give a plug for my employer there to keep them happy, but you should watch some stuff there. But really, what I would hope comes out of Indigenous X is taking it out of that box of thinking that everything is about a challenge. People are very scared of being perceived as racist. A lot of Aboriginal people are very scared of being attacked with racism and their common experiences on both sides, and creating safe spaces where we can have those dialogues where people can ask questions without stressing about it being misinterpreted, having safe spaces for people to share their stories without them being challenged. That's what the idea of Indigenous X is about. And so more than just an account that operates in a certain way, it's a philosophy. That there is a better way, there is a different way we can have a relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, and that can actually improve everyone's lives. I said, even though we talk about closing the gap, and there are crazy issues going on with life expectancy, with education, with employment, with racism, with all of these issues, but everyone is in a position to benefit from Indigenous philosophy. And like I said, we just heard a really awesome talk about sustainability. That is a philosophy that is a core principle in Aboriginal cultures. And so it's not just about, you know, go and learn some dances, go and learn some songs, learn the name of the country you live in. Who knows the name of the country they live in or were born in? And I don't mean Australia, I mean the traditional country. Hands up, who knows? Not a lot, a few. But that's something that I think we should all know. You know, when you go and say, what do you want to go and see around the world? A lot of people say, oh, I want to go see the pyramids. You know, it's amazing. It's 5,000 years old. If you're talking about the pyramids in the Americas, you know, 8,000, 10,000 years old. Do you know where the oldest still standing man-made structure on the planet is? Anyone know? Anyone want to yell it out? Nope, man-made structure. So Uluru wasn't made. Good guess, but the oldest still standing man-made structure is in Brewarrina. Yeah, it's in Brewarrina. Stone fish traps, about 35,000 years old. Just sitting down there at the river. Really easy to go and find. That's on Earth. That's the oldest, still standing, man-made structure on the planet. When you think about that, you think, like, that's something that you would think everyone should know. It's a bit of common trivia. And for most of us, it's within driving distance. Yet we don't even know it's there. And that is a big part of the history of Australia, where it was claimed as terra nullius. Who knows what that means? No man's land, land belonging to no one. And so, you know, that was overturned in the Mabo decision. We know that wasn't true. We know other Aboriginal people had really complex societies. People talk about, oh, well, there was no farming. It's like, yes, there was farming. There were no permanent structures. Yes, there were permanent structures. There was no fences. No, there wasn't fences, but you don't actually need a fence to own property or to have a culture or to have a society. So these arguments that were used against Aboriginal society for so long to justify the claiming of that land without negotiation, without payment, without a treaty, without meaningful ways of coexistence, also created a need not to acknowledge the amazing parts of Aboriginal history, Aboriginal culture and achievement. It created this conflict. Whereas in contemporary times, it isn't that challenging to understand that and to acknowledge that. We have something known as an Aboriginal Stonehenge, which is not like the giant Stonehenge, but in that it works so you can work out the equinox, the longest and shortest days of the years. You can travel, you can watch the movements of the stars and use them to navigate. We have, you know, the sprint start in races. Racers do in the Olympics, they get down in the crouch start. It was an Aboriginal guy who invented that. Freestyle swimming. It was Aboriginal people who introduced that. There are all of these things throughout there that don't take anything away, but actually help us to look at Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal achievement in a different light and recognise, you know, one of the worst things that you find online are those racist memes. Oh, 40,000 years and only invented dot painting, which is actually more of a contemporary introduction anyway. And for anyone on the East Coast, we had X-ray style paintings, we didn't use didgeridoos, yiddicky. There are all these misinformation, these really patronising and simplifying attitudes to Aboriginal society, Aboriginal history, Aboriginal people, Aboriginal culture, that sort of let people just put it over there in their mind and go, oh, there's nothing there worth looking at, we don't need to. They're just trying to make us feel guilty about stuff. All of these really superficial ways of not engaging, of not recognising people's humanity, and of not trying to embrace and to actually understand that what's on offer there is something that is of benefit to all Australia and to the world. All of the different language groups, all of the different cultures. It's not about a competition of which one's better and which one's worse. It's about appreciating that difference and understanding that different climates, different histories, different agendas, different population sizes, different interactions with other populations have shaped global history. And where Indigenous society sits out from that is that being in Australia, just where it is located on the earth, we didn't get caught up in that system of wars that went right through Europe. We had 40,000 years of largely isolated existence that allowed us to refine a system that maintained the population perfectly. There were changes, there were adapters, but we lived through ice ages. We talk about climate change potentially bringing on new ice ages. We worry about how we're going to manage climate change. Indigenous societies survived that and gained strength through those processes. So to think that there's nothing that we can learn from that is really problematic. And what I do with Indigenous X, I'll get a lot of people who'll come and say, I want to help close the gap, what can I do? And it's realising that there's a wonderful quote that I love. This comes from a group of Indigenous people who are out on a mission back in 60s, 70s. A white preacher came in and he said, I'm here to help. And they responded with, if you're here to help us, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with ours, then let us work together. And that's the challenge that we have, is finding ways of how we can break down those barriers, how we can work together. And particularly when we're talking about online racism, when we're talking about corporates responding to social media, responding to challenges, Indigenous X really stumbled across that path and myself got sort of swept along with that wave. So there's been a whole bunch of surreal things that we've been able to achieve that we didn't really set out. We didn't have big meetings. We didn't go, this is the thing we're going to do. Just by having the conversations, we led to impact on change. And so it used to be probably when a lot of you fellas would have been in late primary school, maybe early high school for some of you older ones. When you typed Aboriginal into Google, do you know what used to come up as the recommended search? Aboriginal jokes. Not culture, not art, not achievement, not philosophy, Aboriginal jokes. And that's not Google's fault, that's Australia's fault, because that's what most people were searching for. It becomes the top search. When something gets recommended as the top search, more people are likely to click on it, and it stays the top search. We had a conversation about how problematic that is, because that's every kid in school at some point in their schooling is going to type Aboriginal into Google. And every kid's going to say, oh, I like jokes, I'll go have a look at that. And these were not the jokes that you would show to your children or to your grandparents or to anyone. These were horrific, just overtly racist, disgusting, hurtful things. But like I said, every 8-year-old, every 7-year-old, every high school kid, would have been huge amounts of them who were actually going and looking at that. Just by having the conversation about it, turns out Google Australia had a Twitter account, they overheard our conversation, they removed it from the search engines. So you can still search for it, but you've got to type in the whole thing. It won't recommend it to you. That was the first major form of social change that I stumbled across in online, long before we were campaigning, long before we were fundraising, long before we were looking at things that we could try and impact and try and change. It was just something that happened quite accidentally and quite incidentally. But when I think about the legacy of Indigenous X, I think that's probably one of the greatest things, as a teacher, knowing how many kids would have been stumbling across that I don't think I'll ever top that in my life. I don't think that's anything I do will have more impact on more people than that individual thing. But it led to this thought within a lot of other young Indigenous people at the time who were out online of what you could do. Google is something I think we look at like the dictionary. it's set in stone. You can't really impact on that. I wouldn't know where the Google building is to go and have a march out the front. I wouldn't think of writing a letter saying, "Dear Google, can you please change this?" But when they do have a Twitter account, though, and most of these organisations do, and simply by bringing that into the conversation, like I said, we didn't yell at them, we didn't lobby them, we just said, "God, this is really problematic." And they were like, "Yep, and we're going to help change that." And they did. There has been other instances of mainstream clothing companies selling really racist T-shirts that have actually taken those T-shirts off the shelves because of conversations that have been had online. And the first time we ever raised money was for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. If you don't know them, the ILF, they do really great work. They run reading programs around the country, create language-specific resources and literacy resources for kids who might not otherwise get that additional reading support. And just sort of made a bit of a joke online that sort of snowballed out of control, and within a week we raised $10,000 for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation. Since then, we've gone on with a bit more structure and a bit more thought to it. We've raised over $350,000 for different campaigns. So some of those have been for language card games. Some of those have been for health retreats out on Elcho Island, LGBTQI, mental health, wellbeing, suicide prevention organisation, which didn't exist in Australia. There was nothing specifically for Indigenous LGBTQI groups around health and wellbeing as an actual foundation run by Aboriginal people. They got their seed funding off through crowdfunding with Indigenous X, and now they're out operating, providing those services, offering that support. And so something that I created on Twitter just for a bit of fun has then snowballed to realising we have this opportunity to have an impact. And it's not about me standing up as the leader and going, "This is the thing that we're going to do," but it's about engaging and building a community, so that when someone within that community says, "I have a problem, I have an issue that I've seen, I have something that I'd like to change," the rest of the community can look at that and go, "Yeah, I agree." And they can have those conversations to say, what are we going to do about that? And so the great thing about doing that is, if I ever disappear, Indigenous X goes on without me. That community goes on without me. It isn't relying on me being up the front saying this is what we all need to do and rallying the troops. It's empowering individuals to be that leader when they need to be, but to be just a community member like anyone else. And I think all too often we look for that one person who can lead the charge. And if you've ever been in that space, it's a lot of pressure to be that person and to be that person again and again and again. And not many people really set out to be that person. You just find yourself, you've said something that resonates with people. And they're like, "Yes, we want to get behind you. What can we do to support you?" And for me, when I don't like when people call me a leader. I find it really awkward because I'm not elected, I'm not representative, I'm just an individual who likes to do stuff. But if I'm going to get framed in that light, then what I'd like to say is, a good leader doesn't build more followers, a good leader makes other leaders. And that's what I've tried to do with Indigenous X, and that's how I try to live my life. We might, whoever's running the thing at the back, might just bring up that YouTube video if we can. This, I'll just intro it quickly. So I said when we've done a lot of crowdfunding for different organisations, we did a crowdfunder to build the Indigenous X website, which I'll show you after this. And because I'd raised so much money for other crowdfunding campaigns, people had always been saying, like, "Luke, you really need to do a crowdfunder for yourself," because all of this was unpaid work, unfunded work. This is just something I did because I loved to do it. But we eventually did put up a crowdfunder, and I asked a whole bunch of other people to help make videos or to help promote it. At the time, I think we had probably 20,000 followers on Twitter. We had 1,000 people donate. That's 1 in 20 people. Now, anyone who works in sort of online crowdfunding or call to action, it's really difficult to get that many people to respond. There are so many people doing so many amazing things. So you're lucky to get 1 in 20 people who will click on a link or who will retweet something or who will share it on Facebook. So to get 1 in 20 people who actually opened up their wallets and put money in saying, "We believe in what you do and we want to help you do it better," was yeah, one of the most humbling experiences I've ever had in my life. But it shows that, you know, I have a lot of people coming who, you know, you'd never heard of. It's like, we want to raise $1 million to go and do this amazing thing. And it's that, if you're going to try and get people to rally behind you when you do have a cause, whether it's just sign a petition, whether it's raising money, whether it's lobbying government, whether it's changes within your own school, there's importance of building trust within your community and having people know that it's not just about you. And so when we finally did our crowdfunder, we had a history of 4 years of doing whatever we could to help as many people as we could, as often as we could, with no ask in return. We weren't getting any money, we weren't selling anything. We just believed in a philosophy and want other people to share it. So when we put out the call for videos, there was about like 30, 40 people. I'm not sure if anyone knows First Dog on the Moon. He's a political cartoonist who works for The Guardian. Writes some really awesome stuff, a great way to engage in really complicated political ideas by just reading these hilarious cartoons that he writes. But we had people like him, we had hip-hop stars like El Fresh Lion, Earthboy, Jim Blah make little videos for us. We had the Juice Rap News guys. We had a lot of people who'd been the hosts of Indigenous X. So I'll get you just to play this one if we can.
I'm First Dog on the Moon. Are you a well-meaning white person who doesn't know as much about Aboriginal Australia as you think you should? What the hell have you been doing this whole time? Don't feel guilty, feel informed. Get on Twitter and check out Indigenous X. I know I did.
That was... Thanks to the one person who started that. See, you make change. You start that slow clap, other people join in. That's how you get something to happen. But this video, I mean, I love that one. I'm a big fan of First Dog on the Moon. And I'd never met him. I just put out the call to say, it'd be great if any of you fellas could help use your audiences, your online brands to get behind and support this. And people came out of the woodworks to offer their support, to donate. Journalists who I'd given quotes for or helped understand different issues for when they were writing their stories came back and did stories on Indigenous X, helped get the word out there, helped get change to happen. And so, can you load up the website? So now, once we raised that funds, I contacted an Indigenous IT group. I got an Indigenous lawyer, an Indigenous accountant to help build an actual business around it, to help build our website. And when I say it's about everyone coming together and working together, Indigenous X is solely Indigenous owned. We only have Indigenous hosts. We only employ Indigenous people. And there have been people who's like, oh, well, isn't that divisive? Isn't that against the idea of everyone working together? And I don't think it is. I don't see it as exclusionary. I think it's sending a really important message that doesn't happen a lot within Australia, which is we have the skill set, we have the capacity to do our own, anything we want to do on our own terms. And we collaborate with a lot of non-Indigenous people. Everyone who hosts Indigenous X gets profiled in The Guardian Australia, the newspaper. We have a crowdfunding partnership with Start Some Good, who are a non-Indigenous group. So we will work with and we will collaborate with anyone from any background, anywhere in the world. Since Indigenous X started, we have Indigenous X Canada. So it's a group of Indigenous mob over there in Canada. They really liked the idea. They got in touch and said, we'd like to do something similar. Can you give us some advice? And I was like, you can just have the whole everything. Just take it, it's yours, have fun with it, do what you want to do, because I can't go over to Indigenous Canadians and tell them how to run their show. But there was a couple of Indigenous women from Canada online who I had a lot of respect for, had spent a lot of time interacting with online, had a level of trust with them to just say, it's yours, take it. At the moment, we're doing the same in New Zealand. We're having some conversations about an Indigenous X New Zealand popping up. There's been talks about Indigenous X Brazil, and it'll be one of those things where I won't own that, but hopefully we'll all collaborate together within that. And a lot of other non-Indigenous groups have taken the idea of Indigenous X. There's EduTweetos, has a different educator each week, rotating account, and they acknowledge Indigenous X is where they got their idea from. There's We Public Health. There's any number. So there's a lot of rotating accounts on Twitter now. We're the second one in the world. There's hundreds of them just in Australia. And a lot of them acknowledge Indigenous X as their influence for doing it. And so when we're talking about using social media for social change, it's understanding that you don't have to do it all yourself. It's not actually about you going out there and doing everything to change the world, but it's about being open, about being transparent, about hoping that other people will see what you're doing, will share with it, and will actually take it to places you'd never even thought of. And so most of what Indigenous X has done, we did not set out to do. We came with a simple philosophy, which was it's important that people get to share their own story. And there is a huge lack of spaces in Australia, in Australian media, to hear about Indigenous issues from Indigenous people. So often you'll read a story written about Aboriginal people in the media that doesn't even actually quote an Indigenous person within it. And it's, you go back 20 years and that was pretty much every time. But you'll still see it on TV. There'll be an issue affecting Indigenous people and there'll be a group of non-Indigenous people on TV sitting around a table talking about it, which is just madness. It would be if you were talking about women's issues and had a group of men sitting around talking about it. You've got to actually hear from people who are affected by issues, and not just the same people each time, but different people who are particularly related to that individual issue, that story, who are experts in that field or who live that experience every day. And not any one Indigenous person can speak to all of those issues. Not any one person from anywhere can speak to any of those issues. So Indigenous X started with that idea, and it's actually been picked up. You're seeing now more media people are actually using Indigenous authors when they're writing their Indigenous stories. They're actually interviewing more Indigenous people. And for myself, like I said, I had sort of, when I started, I think I burnt a lot of my opportunities, and I think for your generation, even more than mine, there's this fear that everything you put online could cost you getting a job in the future. Because your future employers are going to read your Twitter feed and they're going to look at your Facebook page, and if you've got really horrible stuff there, it's going to impact on your chances of a career. And to a degree, that's true, if you're putting up really horrible stuff. But for my generation growing up, the thing that we were told would cost us our employment issues were sleeve tattoos, which I'm not a big fan of tattoos, so I don't have any. But it was always said growing up, if you get a sleeve tattoo, you'll have to wear long sleeve shirts your whole time, or you just won't be able to get a decent job. And then so many people got them so quickly that that couldn't be true anymore. You see politicians with tattoos now. You see police walking down the street with sleeve tattoos. You see celebrities and football stars. It became a really common thing. And just like when social media started, everyone was really scared of it. And you would hear people talk about someone losing their job for social media, which is a thing that does happen and can happen. But all of you now have such a large digital footprint that it's going to be really hard for your employers to not hire people because they have a silly joke on Facebook, or they've put up a photo of themselves, or whatever it is, because that's going to be all of our life stories. We're all going to have that footprint. But when I started it, because I spoke quite openly about the problems I had with the Department of Education, with my thoughts on racism, with my thoughts on government, and my training, my education only really lent me to public service jobs working within government. So even teachers are public servants. We're technically employed by the government. I didn't know that I was going to have any opportunities. I was getting ready to go and become a bricklayer, which is what my dad had been before me. And then social media sort of ramped up to such a point that now that when I'm working as a senior digital producer at NITV, that's because they came to me and said, man, we really like what you've done with Indigenous X. We'd like you to come and do that for our organisation too. So now I get to actually work for an actual media organisation doing the same thing that I've always tried to do with Indigenous X, is when there's a story, let's try to talk to those people most affected by it. Let's try to get their perspective on that story. And now I went from being one of those people on social media who was, you might have made it very difficult to ever actually get a job after this, to it's what's got me the job that I have. And so for you guys, the opportunities that are going to come out of this in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, it doesn't really matter what the platform is. It doesn't actually matter if it's on Snapchat, it doesn't matter if it's Facebook, it doesn't matter if it's Twitter, it doesn't matter if it's Instagram, it doesn't matter if it's something that we've never heard of that pops up tomorrow, the next day, the day after. It is, you have opportunities to connect in ways that the generation before mine never even imagined, that me growing up never imagined. When I was in year 10, we actually went on a high school excursion to the local university to see the internet. And it was something that we didn't know about. It was, we went there and we were there for like 3 hours, and I tried to download one picture and I didn't download the whole thing after the 3 hours because that's how slow the internet was when I started. Whereas now, I can send a single tweet that can resonate with people and within 5 minutes can reach 1 million people around the world. And that is insane. And when we're talking about those barriers that exist between groups, when we're talking about that lack of understanding, but not just, like I said, Indigenous people is where Indigenous X is centred, but whatever group you represent, whatever group you're a part of, there's a chance to build connections within that group, to build solidarity and unity, and there's opportunities to change the way other people look at that group. There's opportunities to change how the media talk about that group. At the moment, we're seeing, like I said, Aboriginal people used to be really horrifically mistreated within media about how we were reported on and the stories that would go out. We're seeing that same thing now with Muslims, in that our focus is on really horrific horror stories rather than on humanising stories, and rather on giving opportunities for people to tell their own story about their own communities. And we're going to see that again with other groups in the future. But online gives us the opportunity to be our own media space, to be our own media platform. So I don't really watch TV except online. I don't really buy newspapers to read. I read my articles online. I get my news. I don't trust one newspaper or one person. I have people on social media who I trust who then will say to me, hey, Luke, you should read this article. This will be of interest to you. This might be someone you might want to get involved with, someone you might want to talk to. And so we create our own media. I have my own website where we publish our own articles now and get to work within NITV's website as well. Other people get to have their own blogs. We don't have to be reliant on these traditional sources of information. And so this might not change the world, as in the whole world, but I never wanted to do that anyway. But when you can get to change one person's life, and when you can get to make a connection with another person, when you can get to build these relationships, it doesn't matter the scale of it. It doesn't matter if you just save one person, if you do it for 100, if you do it for 1,000, if you do it for 1,000,000. Like I said, that one thing, changing the Google algorithm, is probably the biggest impact I'll ever had in terms of people who I'll never know. But the impacts we've been able to have with individuals has been amazing. Individual people who felt lost and were able to reconnect with community through Indigenous X. People growing up in areas where there might not be many Indigenous people, or working remote, people working overseas. Who've been able to reconnect and been able to have that community. I've had non-Indigenous parents of Indigenous kids saying, I've had no idea about how to tell them about their history, about their culture, and have been able to make connections through Indigenous X to begin that journey for themselves. We've had people who've created new groups offline to go and try to achieve things. And like I said, I don't know, when we talk about social media for social change, what I would say is it's good to have some outcomes in mind if there are specific things that you really care about, that you really want to make an impact on. But don't be so focused on those things that you miss other opportunities. And those other opportunities might be a campaign that you'd never thought about, but it might also just be a friendship. It might be someone who's doing it tough that you can offer a bit of support for. This is what social change is, because when we talk about these big picture national global issues, we forget that the whole world of people at the end of the day always boils down to just you and me and 7 billion other individuals. I think sometimes when we look at those big pictures, we forget the small picture and the importance of that. It's about what we do with each other all day, every day. And if we do it well enough, and if we can be open enough about what we're doing and why we're doing it, other people will come along. It doesn't have to be everyone. It will never be everyone. But that isn't the goal. The goal is to live your life in the best way that you can and to hopefully have more of a positive impact on the world than we have a negative impact. There are things we learned about in the sustainability talk where you can have an impact without even thinking about it that can be negative. But once you realise that, you can start to look at ways to change that into a positive impact. And so my main goal for Indigenous X at the end of the day is I just hope we do more good than not. And I'll be happy with that. I'm not looking for anything more than that. So, like I said, we'll go into some, in the workshop later, I'm getting the wrap-up signs from up the back. In the workshop, we'll actually talk really specifically about strategies for, when you do have a cause that you care about, to how to get that message out, how to educate people, how to inform people, how to build networks and communities to cause change. But all I really wanted to talk about today is I don't want people with Indigenous X, with anything that I say, to go, yep, I have to agree with everything he said. The goal is never that and should never be that. But if everyone can understand where I'm coming from and why I'm trying to achieve, then we can break down those barriers of demonising the other over there. Oh, well, they're just doing this for this reason. I do what I do in the hopes that I can have a positive impact. Other people do their things for other reasons. But growing up, something I've always been told was, you can't claim that someone else is wrong with their opinion until you understand why they think they're right. And so for me, trying to challenge attitudes about racism, sometimes I'll get angry and just go, you're too much for me, I just can't talk to you. But what I try to do is go, tell me where you get this from. Tell me why you think this thing is true, and give me enough respect to listen to me when I tell you why it's wrong. And most racism that exists out there in the world today comes from misinformation and misunderstanding. And when you can have that equal opportunity to sit down and share those stories and give people an opportunity to see it from another side and to change their own attitude, that's as much as you can hope for. We're only 3% of the population up against 97%. We don't have the time for every Aboriginal person to come and talk to groups of people, to work down one-on-one. We've got to have these things online where people can be given the opportunity to change it themselves, because I truly believe most people don't want to be racist. Most people don't want to hurt other people and make them feel bad. But if they have that ignorance and that lack of understanding and people are telling them things about this other group of people, it's very easy not to challenge those views. It's very easy just to go along with that if that's all you've ever been told. And I just hope we can give an opportunity to say to people, actually there is a lot more to the story than what you might have been told, no matter what you've been told about Indigenous Australia. And you're invited to come along, listen, learn, and actually not just help us close the gap, but help yourself have a better picture of the world and your role within it. That's about me, guys.